That's her, the foreign spy. The whispers followed Staff Sergeant Madison Wright everywhere she went on Forward Operating Base Sentinel in an undisclosed region of volatile territory. At 29 years old, with olive skin inherited from her Lebanese grandmother, dark eyes that seemed to see everything, and fluent Arabic that she'd learned at her grandmother's knee, Madison didn't fit the stereotype of what her fellow soldiers expected an American combat engineer to look like. They saw her appearance, heard her speaking Arabic to local interpreters, noticed how she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the culture and language of the region, and they jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Her unit commander had received 3 separate reports questioning her loyalty, suggesting she might be feeding intelligence to hostile forces, recommending that she be removed from her position and investigated. Madison had endured the suspicion, the isolation, the constant scrutiny of soldiers who should have been her brothers and sisters in arms. What none of them knew was that when a coordinated assault with more than 40 fighters breached the base perimeter in the pre-dawn darkness, Madison Wright would become the thin line between survival and massacre. Her M4 carbine with attached M23 grenade launcher delivering precision fire and explosive devastation that would eliminate enemy fighters, save her entire unit, and prove that loyalty isn't determined by appearance or language, but by the willingness to fight when everything is on the line. Staff Sergeant Madison Wright had been assigned to Forward Operating Base Sentinel for 3 months, serving as a combat engineer responsible for maintaining defensive positions, coordinating force protection measures, and ensuring that the base's physical security remained effective against threats in this undisclosed hostile region. But from the moment she'd arrived, her fellow soldiers had viewed her with suspicion rather than trust. Madison's appearance, olive skin, dark eyes, and features that reflected her Lebanese heritage, combined with her fluent Arabic, created a perfect storm of prejudice and paranoia among soldiers who couldn't reconcile what they saw with their assumptions about who belonged in an American uniform. The whispers started within days of her arrival. She looks Middle Eastern. Why would they assign someone like that to a combat zone? I heard her speaking Arabic to the interpreters. How do we know she's not feeding them intelligence? There's something off about her. The way she moves, the way she watches everything. That's not normal. Madison heard the whispers, saw the suspicious glances, felt the isolation that came from being viewed as a potential threat rather than a teammate. Her attempts to build relationships with her fellow soldiers were met with polite distance at best and open hostility at worst. Captain Robert Harrison, her company commander, called her into his office during her 2nd week at the base. "Wright, I need to ask you some questions about your background and your interactions with local nationals." Madison had expected this conversation, but it still hurt. "Sir, my background check was completed before I deployed. My security clearance is current. My loyalty to the United States has never been in question." Harrison looked uncomfortable. "I understand that, Wright, but I've received concerns from several soldiers in the unit about your appearance and your language capabilities. They're questioning whether someone with your background should be in a position where they have access to sensitive information about base defenses." "Sir, my grandmother immigrated to the United States from Lebanon in 1975. My father was born in Detroit. I was born in Michigan. I am as American as anyone else in this unit. The fact that I inherited my grandmother's appearance and learned her language doesn't make me a security threat." "I understand your position, Wright, but perception matters in a combat zone. When soldiers don't trust each other, unit cohesion suffers. I need you to be aware that your interactions with local nationals are being scrutinized." Madison felt anger rising but kept her voice professional. "Sir, my job as a combat engineer requires me to interact with local contractors who help maintain base infrastructure. Speaking their language allows me to ensure they're doing quality work and not creating vulnerabilities in our defenses. That's not suspicious. It's effective performance of my duties." Harrison nodded slowly. "I hear you, Wright. But I need you to understand the situation from the unit's perspective. We're in hostile territory, surrounded by people who want to kill us. When someone looks and sounds like potential threats we face, it creates concerns. Sir, with respect, I don't look like the enemy. I look like an American soldier with Lebanese heritage who happens to be doing her job professionally and effectively. Harrison dismissed her with instructions to be mindful of perceptions, but the damage was done. The fact that her own company commander had questioned her loyalty would spread through the unit within hours. And it did. By the next day, Madison found herself eating meals alone, conducting equipment inspections without the casual conversation that usually accompanied such work, and being excluded from the informal social interactions that built unit cohesion. Master Sergeant Angela Rivera, the platoon sergeant who should have been her primary mentor and advocate, approached her during a routine patrol of defensive positions. "Wright, we need to talk about something. Several soldiers have expressed concerns about your loyalty and your interactions with local nationals." Madison had reached her limit. "Sergeant, my loyalty has been questioned, investigated, and verified by every level of military security screening. My interactions with local nationals consist of doing my job as a combat engineer. If soldiers in this unit have concerns about my performance, they should document specific incidents and submit them through proper channels rather than spreading rumors based on my appearance." Rivera's expression hardened. "Your attitude isn't helping your situation, Wright. When soldiers question your loyalty, getting defensive makes you look guilty." "Sergeant, what exactly should I do? Apologize for my grandmother's genetics? Stop speaking Arabic even though it makes me more effective at my job? Dye my hair blonde and wear colored contacts so I match people's expectations of what an American soldier should look like?" What you should do is recognize that perception matters in a combat zone and adjust your behavior accordingly. Madison spent the next 6 weeks enduring systematic isolation from her unit. She conducted her duties professionally and effectively, but the social fabric that normally connected soldiers serving together in combat zones had been torn apart by suspicion and prejudice. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Blake, the battalion commander, called Madison into her office during the 8th week of deployment. "Wright, I've reviewed the concerns that have been raised about your loyalty and your conduct. I want to be clear. I've found no evidence of any security violations, no indication of any inappropriate conduct, and no reason to question your loyalty to the United States." Madison felt cautious hope. "Thank you, ma'am." "However," Blake continued, "the perception issues within the unit are affecting cohesion and morale. I'm considering whether it might be better to reassign you to a different unit where your background wouldn't create the same concerns." "Ma'am, with respect, reassigning me because other soldiers have prejudiced views about my appearance sends exactly the wrong message. It tells them that their suspicions were justified and that the military will accommodate racism rather than address it." Blake looked uncomfortable. "I understand your perspective, Wright, but my primary responsibility is unit effectiveness. If your presence is creating division, I have to consider all options." "Ma'am, I'm not creating division. Prejudice is creating division. Reassigning me won't solve that problem. It will just hide it until the next soldier who doesn't match expectations joins the unit." Blake dismissed her without making a final decision, but Madison knew that her days at Forward Sentinel were numbered unless something changed dramatically. That change came 3 days later, in the pre-dawn darkness of a September morning. Intelligence had indicated that hostile forces were planning attacks against American positions in the region, but the specific timing and targets weren't clear. Forward Sentinel had increased its security posture, but the soldiers manning defensive positions during the 0300 to 0600 guard shift were the same soldiers who had spent weeks questioning whether Madison Wright could be trusted. Madison was conducting a routine inspection of defensive barriers when the attack began. The first indication was an explosion at the base perimeter, an IED designed to breach the defensive wall and create an entry point for attacking forces. Before anyone could respond to the initial blast, hostile fighters began pouring through the breach in a coordinated assault that demonstrated significant planning and reconnaissance. More than 40 fighters armed with AK-47 rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and explosives attacked FOB Sentinel with the clear intention of overrunning the base and killing everyone inside. Madison was approximately 50 meters from the breach when the attack began. Her M4 carbine with attached M203 40mm grenade launcher was slung across her body as she conducted her inspection. The M4/M203 combination was one of the most versatile weapon systems in the American arsenal. The carbine provided accurate rifle fire out to 500 meters, while the grenade launcher could deliver high explosive rounds against concentrated positions or vehicles up to 400 meters away. Madison had trained extensively with both weapon systems during her years in the Army, and her proficiency was rated as expert marksman. The rules of engagement were simple: defend the base against hostile attack using whatever force was necessary. Madison brought her M4 to the ready position and began engaging fighters who were pouring through the breach in the perimeter wall. Her first shots were controlled pairs, 2 rapid shots per target, a technique designed to maximize accuracy while maintaining speed of engagement. The first fighter dropped, then the second, then the third. Madison's muscle memory from hundreds of hours of marksmanship training took over. Acquire target, controlled breathing, smooth trigger press, follow through, transition to next target. She moved to a defensive position behind concrete barriers that gave her both protection from incoming fire and a clear field of fire on the breach point. From this position, she had excellent visibility of hostile forces attempting to establish a foothold inside the base perimeter. Her M4 carbine cracked repeatedly as she engaged fighters with precision rifle fire. Each controlled pair of shots eliminated a threat. Each magazine change was executed smoothly, maintaining continuous fire discipline while managing her ammunition supply. But the hostile forces kept coming, more than 40 fighters attempting to push through the breach and overrun the base through sheer numbers. Madison assessed the tactical situation and made a critical decision. She needed to use the M203 grenade launcher to break up the concentrated assault. She loaded a 40mm high-explosive round into the M203's breach, aimed at a cluster of approximately 6 fighters who were attempting to establish a support position near the breach, and fired. The grenade arced through the pre-dawn darkness and detonated precisely where she'd aimed it. The explosion eliminated the entire group and disrupted the coordination of the assault. Madison immediately loaded another 40mm round and engaged a second concentration of fighters. The grenade launcher's devastating area effects were perfectly suited for breaking up the kind of massed assault that hostile forces were conducting. Throughout the base, soldiers were scrambling to respond to the surprise attack. The quick reaction force was mobilizing, defensive positions were being manned, and communications were going out requesting immediate support from aviation assets. But in those critical first minutes, Madison Wright was the primary force preventing fighters from exploiting their breach and overrunning the base. She alternated between precision rifle fire from her M4 and devastating grenade strikes from her M203, systematically eliminating fighters and breaking up their assault formations before they could establish effective positions inside the base perimeter. This is Wright. Hostile forces breaching perimeter at Sector 3. I'm engaging with rifle and grenade launcher. Need reinforcements immediately. Her radio call galvanized the base's response. Soldiers who had spent weeks questioning her loyalty now heard her voice calmly reporting contact, while the sounds of her M4 firing and grenades detonating in the background demonstrated that she was actively engaged in defending their positions. Staff Sergeant Kyle Morrison, who had been one of the soldiers questioning her background and loyalty, grabbed his rifle and led a fire team toward Madison's position to reinforce her defense of the breach. As he approached, he saw Madison conducting tactical movement between defensive positions, engaging targets with her M4 while loading and firing 40mm grenades with practiced efficiency. Her movement was professional, her fire discipline was excellent, and her tactical decisions were keeping hostile forces from establishing positions inside the base perimeter. Right. What's the situation? Morrison shouted over the sound of gunfire and explosions. Approximately 40 fighters breached the perimeter at Sector 3. I've been engaging them for the past 5 minutes with rifle and grenade fire. They're attempting to establish a foothold inside the base, but I'm keeping them suppressed. I need additional forces to seal the breach and eliminate the hostile presence. Morrison deployed his fire team to support Madison's position while calling for additional reinforcements. But what he saw over the next 20 minutes would fundamentally change how he viewed the soldier he'd questioned weeks earlier. Madison Wright conducted a masterclass in combined arms combat at the individual soldier level. She used her M4 carbine for precision engagements against individual targets, placing accurate fire on fighters who attempted to maneuver or establish firing positions. When hostile forces concentrated for assault pushes, she employed the M203 grenade launcher to break up their formations with devastating explosive strikes. Her tactical awareness was exceptional. She identified priority targets, managed her fields of fire, coordinated with supporting forces, and maintained continuous pressure on hostile forces throughout the engagement. Her fluent Arabic, which had been cited as evidence of potential disloyalty, became a critical intelligence asset when she began monitoring hostile communications on captured radios and providing real-time translations of tactical discussions. I'm hearing communications. They're reporting heavy casualties and requesting reinforcement. Their commander is telling them to break off the assault. They're taking too many losses. Morrison looked at Madison with new understanding. How many fighters have you eliminated? I don't have an accurate count, but I've engaged multiple targets with both rifle fire and grenades throughout the breach area. The M203 has been extremely effective at breaking up their assault formations. The battle continued for another 30 minutes as American forces systematically eliminated fighters who had breached the perimeter. Aviation support arrived and engaged forces attempting to retreat from the failed attack. When the shooting finally stopped and base security forces conducted a sweep of the area, they counted 42 fighters killed in the assault on FOB Sentinel. Madison Wright, employing her M4 carbine and M203 grenade launcher with expert precision, had personally engaged and eliminated approximately 32 of those fighters during the critical first minutes of the attack, when she'd been the only force preventing them from overrunning the base. The base commander, Colonel Richard Garrett, arrived at the breach site as the sun rose over FOB Sentinel. "Someone give me a sit rep. What the hell happened here?" Staff Sergeant Morrison, still processing what he'd witnessed, provided the briefing. "Sir, hostile forces breached the perimeter at 0347 hours with approximately 42 fighters. Staff Sergeant Wright was conducting perimeter inspection and immediately engaged forces with her M4 rifle and M203 grenade launcher. She maintained continuous fire for approximately 5 minutes until reinforcements arrived, preventing forces from establishing positions inside the base perimeter." Garrett looked at the defensive position Madison had been holding. Spent brass casings and empty grenade casings littered the ground around multiple fighting positions where she'd moved tactically while engaging forces. "One soldier held off 42 fighters for 5 minutes? Sir, Staff Sergeant Wright's employment of her weapon systems was exceptional. She used precision rifle fire against individual targets and grenade strikes against concentrated formations. Her tactical decisions prevented forces from exploiting their numerical advantage. Additionally, she monitored hostile communications in Arabic and provided real-time intelligence about intentions and casualties." Garrett walked over to where Madison was sitting, conducting post-combat maintenance on her M4 while a medic checked her for injuries. "Right. Sergeant Morrison tells me you held this position alone for 5 minutes against 42 fighters." Madison stood at attention despite her exhaustion. "Sir, I engaged hostile forces with my rifle and grenade launcher while calling for reinforcements. When supporting forces arrived, we conducted coordinated defense of the breach until the attack was repelled." Garrett studied her for a long moment. "I've also been told that for the past 2 months, soldiers in this unit have been questioning your loyalty based on your appearance and language abilities. Madison said nothing. Wright, what you did this morning, defending this base against overwhelming forces while your fellow soldiers questioned whether you could be trusted, that's the definition of loyalty. You had every reason to hesitate, to question whether soldiers who doubted you deserved your protection, but you didn't hesitate. You fought. Sir, they're my soldiers, my unit. Regardless of their doubts about me, I wasn't going to let them die. Garrett nodded slowly. Staff Sergeant Wright, I'm recommending you for the Silver Star for gallantry in action. What you accomplished this morning saved lives and prevented this base from being overrun. He turned to address Morrison and the assembled soldiers who had gathered to assess the battle damage. Let me be clear about something. Staff Sergeant Wright is an American soldier who proved her loyalty and her courage under fire. Any soldier who questions her dedication to this unit or this country after what happened this morning needs to seriously reconsider their own judgment and their own prejudices. The impact of Madison's actions rippled through FOB Sentinel in ways that changed the culture of the entire unit. Master Sergeant Rivera, who had questioned her loyalty and suggested she adjust her behavior to accommodate others' prejudices, approached her later that day. Wright, I owe you an apology. I let prejudice and assumptions cloud my judgment about your character and your dedication. What you did this morning, holding that position alone, engaging forces with expert marksmanship, providing intelligence through your language skills, that saved lives. It saved my life. Madison accepted her apology with professional grace, but the hurt from months of suspicion and isolation didn't disappear immediately. The soldiers who had whispered about her being a foreign spy, who had excluded her from unit activities, who had questioned whether someone with her appearance belonged in an American uniform, now approached her with a mixture of shame and gratitude. Specialist Bryce Coleman, who had been one of the more vocal critics of Madison's presence in the unit, spoke for many when he said, Sergeant Wright, I judged you based on what you looked like instead of who you were. You risked your life to defend soldiers who doubted you. That's something I'll never forget, and I'll spend the rest of my career making sure no one else makes the same mistake I did. But Madison's story was bigger than just one unit's transformation. Her actions at FOB Sentinel became a case study that forced the entire military to examine how prejudice and assumption affected unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. Brigadier General Thomas Franklin, who commanded all forces in the theater, visited FOB Sentinel 2 weeks after the attack to present Madison with her Silver Star and to address the broader implications of what had happened. Staff Sergeant Wright's actions during the assault on this base were extraordinary by any measure, Franklin told the assembled soldiers. But what makes her story particularly significant is the context. This is a soldier who endured months of suspicion, isolation, and prejudice from fellow soldiers who couldn't see past her appearance to recognize her dedication and capability. Franklin paused to let his words sink in. When the attack came, Sergeant Wright had every reason to question whether soldiers who doubted her deserved her protection. But she didn't hesitate. She fought with courage and skill to defend her unit. That's not just loyalty. That's the highest form of military service. The general continued. This incident should force all of us to examine our assumptions and our prejudices. How many talented soldiers have we lost or marginalized because they didn't match our preconceptions? How many units have suffered reduced effectiveness because prejudice prevented proper integration of capable personnel? Madison's Silver Star citation was detailed and specific, for gallantry in action against armed hostile forces. Staff Sergeant Madison Wright distinguished herself through exceptionally valorous conduct while serving as a combat engineer at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. When hostile forces breached the base perimeter with more than 40 fighters in a coordinated assault, Staff Sergeant Wright immediately engaged forces with her M4 carbine and M203 grenade launcher, conducting sustained precision fire and devastating grenade strikes that prevented forces from establishing positions inside the base perimeter. For approximately 5 minutes, while reinforcements mobilized, Staff Sergeant Wright was the sole American force engaging fighters and preventing base penetration. Her expert employment of rifle and grenade launcher systems, tactical movement under fire, and decisive action eliminated approximately 32 hostile fighters and saved the lives of more than 100 American soldiers. Additionally, Staff Sergeant Wright monitored hostile communications and provided real-time intelligence that aided in the successful defense of the base. Her actions reflect great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. But perhaps more significant than the medal was what happened in the months following the attack. The Army began a comprehensive review of how diversity and inclusion affected combat readiness. Training programs were developed to address unconscious bias and its impact on unit cohesion. Commander evaluation systems were modified to assess how well leaders fostered inclusive environments that maximized the capabilities of all soldiers, regardless of background or appearance. Madison Wright became an instructor at the Warrior Leader course, teaching young sergeants about leadership, combat effectiveness, and the critical importance of judging soldiers by their performance rather than their appearance. Her class on perception versus performance in combat units became required instruction for all sergeant candidates, using her own experience as a teaching example of how prejudice could undermine unit effectiveness and how leadership could either enable or eliminate such prejudice. Years later, when Lieutenant Colonel Madison Wright spoke at the Army War College about diversity and combat effectiveness, she reflected on her experience at FOB Sentinel. When I arrived at that base, soldiers saw my appearance and heard me speaking Arabic, and they jumped to the conclusion that I must be a security threat. They couldn't reconcile what they saw with their assumptions about what an American soldier should look like. That prejudice created division, undermined unit cohesion, and made us less effective as a fighting force. She paused, then continued. But here's what changed everything. When 42 fighters attacked our base with the intention of killing everyone. Inside, none of them cared about my appearance or my language abilities. They just wanted to destroy us. And in that moment, the only thing that mattered was whether I could fight effectively to defend my unit. Everything else, all the assumptions, all the prejudices, all the suspicions, became completely irrelevant. Madison's story became more than military history. It became a reminder that excellence and dedication transcend appearance, that loyalty is proven through action rather than assumption, and that the most dangerous prejudice in any organization is the one that prevents capable people from contributing their full abilities. The soldiers at FOB Sentinel learned that lesson the hard way, by watching someone they doubted fight with exceptional courage to save their lives. And in learning that lesson, they became better soldiers, better leaders, and better representatives of the values they claimed to defend. Because sometimes the most important battle isn't against external enemies. It's against the prejudices and assumptions that prevent us from recognizing excellence when it doesn't match our expectations. Madison Wright had fought both battles with the same courage and effectiveness, and she'd proven that real loyalty isn't about matching expectations or conforming to stereotypes. It's about standing and fighting when everything is on the line, regardless of whether the people you're protecting appreciate your dedication or question your right to be there. The cultural transformation that began at FOB Sentinel rippled outward through the entire military. Within 2 years of Madison's actions, the Army had implemented comprehensive training programs addressing unconscious bias, revised its leadership evaluation criteria to include diversity and inclusion metrics, and established clear consequences for leaders who fostered discriminatory environments. But perhaps the most significant change was attitudinal rather than procedural. Young soldiers entering the military after Madison's story became widely known grew up in an army that had been forced to confront its prejudices and acknowledge that excellence doesn't conform to stereotypes. Captain Robert Harrison, who had questioned Madison's loyalty during their first conversation, later reflected on his failure of leadership. I was prioritizing unit comfort over unit effectiveness. I was willing to scrutinize a highly capable soldier rather than address the prejudices that were creating division. Staff Sergeant Wright's actions showed me that real leadership means confronting prejudice, not accommodating it. Harrison went on to become a battalion commander himself, and he made diversity and inclusion a cornerstone of his leadership philosophy. His units consistently scored highest in both combat effectiveness and soldier satisfaction, proving that inclusive environments enhanced rather than diminished military capability. Staff Sergeant Kyle Morrison, who had been among those questioning Madison's presence in the unit, became one of the Army's most vocal advocates for combating prejudice in military units. He spoke frequently at leadership courses about his own failure to recognize excellence because of his preconceptions. I looked at Staff Sergeant Wright and saw her appearance and language abilities as potential security threats rather than combat assets, Morrison told young soldiers during training. My prejudice made me doubt a soldier who was more dedicated and more capable than most of us in that unit. When the attack came, she proved her loyalty by risking her life to defend soldiers who had questioned whether she deserved to wear our uniform. That's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my career. Specialist Bryce Coleman, who had been among the most vocal critics of Madison's presence, left the Army after his deployment and became a diversity and inclusion consultant for corporations struggling with similar issues. My experience with Sergeant Wright taught me that prejudice isn't just morally wrong. It's operationally stupid, Coleman explained during corporate training sessions. We had one of the most capable soldiers in our unit, and instead of leveraging her abilities, we marginalized her because she didn't match our expectations. In combat, that kind of stupidity gets people killed. In business, it makes organizations less competitive and less effective. The story of Madison Wright became required reading at West Point, the Army War College, and every level of military professional education. Her experience was analyzed not just as a combat action, but as a case study in how prejudice affects organizational effectiveness and how leaders must actively combat bias rather than accommodate it. At her retirement ceremony, after 24 years of distinguished service, Colonel Madison Wright reflected on her experience. You don't owe anyone a combat action to prove your loyalty. The idea that I had to fight and nearly die before my fellow soldiers would accept me as an American is itself a symptom of the prejudice we need to eliminate. Future soldiers shouldn't have to prove what background checks and professional performance have already demonstrated. Real change happens when we judge people by their capability and character, not by whether they match our assumptions about what excellence should look like. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this one.